Hi everyone, and again, welcome to this Axiomatics webinar on building love and compatibility between RBAC and ABAC, role-based access control, and attribute-based access control, a Valentine's tale. And without further ado, let me introduce our speakers for today. First of all, we have Jerry Gable, who is the president of Axiomatics Americas. Good afternoon, Jerry. I was going to say good morning, but no, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, David.
Jerry has been with Axiomatics for 6 years now, and before that worked for the Burton Group. He's a specialist in identity and access management, and even more so in the space of attribute-based access control. The other speaker today is myself, David Broussard. I've also been with the company 6 years, and I focus on customer deployments, and I have a background in service-oriented architecture, APIs, federation, and now access control. And Jerry, on that note, I'll hand it over to you to introduce the agenda.
Okay, thanks very much, David. And again, thanks everyone for joining us. So I hope you indulge us the use of the Valentine's theme here today. We wanted to get a little bit fun with the topic. So our agenda really is to talk about RBAC, this old and reliable and faithful companion that's been around for quite some time. But since it was designed, say, a few decades ago, it was built for a much simpler world, and there are some limitations that we'll discuss as we proceed here. But David, then you'll come back and talk to us about how ABAC has rekindled things and rejuvenated our love and need for role-based access control, and how the two work so well together.
Yes,
and I think that's the real theme we want to get through here, right, David?
Absolutely.
So as we move forward here to the first section and talk a little bit about the history of RBAC, this has been around here for quite a long time, role-based access control. On the next slide, David, if you would, was a model formalized probably as early as the 1970s, way before you were born, David, but not for me. And in the early 90s,
you were quite old by then already, right?
Already, of course. But in the early 90s, NIST put together an effort to standardize the model, and they've been one of the leaders in doing that over the years. And I believe ANSI also has a more international standardization of the model too, if I remember that right, David.
Yeah, that is correct. Yes.
And so the basic idea here, the basic concept is that we grant access via these role definitions instead of the individual user ID. So we're moving beyond the previous realm or era of having access control lists that might have listed every individual user ID or even group IDs in the access list. So the role, essentially, the role definition is a collection of permissions or entitlements, and you can have roles that are more business functional roles, like manager, senior manager, and so on, or you could have even functional IT roles, IT manager, system administrator, and those kinds of functions. And David, on the next slide, we show a very simple, straightforward mapping here of how this operates. So again, we have these permissions or entitlements that are assigned to the role definition itself, and this is based on the the business requirements, or it could be based on just the structure and the nature of the application itself. That it's hardwired to this kind of role-based model. And then, of course, users are assigned to these roles, or in fact, they could have multiple roles if they need different groupings of these permissions or entitlements. And David, that of course becomes very beneficial for a number of reasons.
Correct. So I think the main one that we see with customers, Jerry, and that's the first point you have on your slide, is the ability to manage more efficiently.
And absolutely, and to use that at administration time. So we're as you get employees or contractors joining the company and assigned to different departments and so on, we use that administration time user provisioning process to assign roles and other entitlements to users. And what this really does is give those administrators the leverage or the capability of managing large user populations, because you have this abstraction layer of the role definitions. And of course, this has been deployed over many years within many organizations, both commercial and public sector. And there's some additional benefits here. For example, you can have different kinds of hierarchies. So you can have a manager role, but then subsequent to that, a US manager, a European manager. Even within them, you can have further breakdowns of, say, a regional manager, for the West, for the East and Central, and the like. And at the bottom here, a common use case is to create separate roles for people that can perform one business function, like a purchaser who could create purchase orders, and then to have a separate role for those people that have the authority to review and approve those purchase orders. And this also introduces the idea of toxic combinations. So, for example, it would be a business risk if one person, one user, had both roles assigned to them, because theoretically they could create a purchase order, make it payable to themselves or to an accomplice, and then also be able to approve that. So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to do, but with a role-based model, it's typically a very static kind of operation. And we'll see where we can make that more flexible in the future.
You achieve this segregation through making sure that you do not assign toxic roles to the same person, and that, of course, that works in a simple world, in a small environment, in the 1980s type world, but it no longer works, right, Jerry?
That's right. And with complex applications today, and also rather sophisticated business scenarios, and doing more with less, we find that people have the responsibility to both create and approve purchase orders. In our example here, they just should be restricted from approving their own purchase orders. So that's certainly a limitation. Another thing that we see is the difficulty in the role engineering process, that is just designing the role structure and the associated entitlements or privileges that are associated with them, because they end up being rather static hierarchies when you're finished with that process, but of course the business continually changes. You need to have new requirements coming in, so that leads to more role generation over time. And with the user provisioning or administrative process, you need to constantly be on top of all the joiner, mover, leaver activity that's happening to make sure that the role assignments are current and accurate. Because if that's not happening, then what often occurs is that users will accumulate more and more roles over time, and of course then they end up with excess permissions, which is of course a business risk. And then there's the scale factor too, because of the fact that we're building new roles all the time to address new scenarios, we end up with this infamous role explosion situation, David, which we've seen a number of times.
True. So the two main pain points that I see with customers is the scale aspect, the fact that you end up with, in order to achieve the granularity that you need in today's environment, you end up with 10 times or 20 times the number of roles that you have employees. That, of course, is not manageable. And then also something that is very tangible and easy to measure is the amount of time people spend managing and reviewing the role assignments and the permission assignments. Not only does it take them time, so and that's of course directly linked to the cost, but also it is really hard for people to review assignments and make sure they're doing a good job of approving the assignments, because, like you said earlier, Jerry, roles can be both functional roles, technical roles, business roles, and sometimes the meaning, the semantics of the roles are not clear to the people approving those role assignments, which means in turn that they cannot do a great job of reviewing the access their employees or their subordinates have.
That's absolutely true, and you've got a good graphic of the scenario on the next slide here, this role explosion situation, and we certainly have seen a number of examples of where this happens, and And you made me think of something else, David. That is, we've heard of even one customer that's employing a full-time staff of something like 50 people to manually review role assignments to make sure they're properly assigned, but also to make sure that the toxic combinations don't exist. So you're absolutely right. The ongoing maintenance can be rather high for this kind of model if you try to stretch it too far.
Right.
But David, what about on this slide here, continuing with the Valentine's theme, or this reminds me of the narcissist's dilemma, or like what one of my friends like to say, enough about me, let's talk about me, right? What we're pointing out here is that RBAC is very centered on the identity of the user, which doesn't take into account the other parameters that are really important in access control decisions. Information about the object or the resource they're accessing, the different kinds of actions they can perform, and of course anything about the environment, what network they're coming in from, what kind of device, and things of that nature. So RBAC just is not dynamic or aware of this kind of context, and which it's still suitable for the provisioning or administrative time access control, but really not so much for runtime.
Correct. And the richer the information you're dealing with, the richer the means to get access to that information, and the bigger or the greater the number of users in your environment, the more difficult it will be to express the right level of access control by simply using RBAC. It just won't work.
Right. And so we see on the next slide here, where RBAC is widely used is more for administrative time access control, as we just mentioned. So this is the user provisioning type of process for those movers, joiners, leavers. But also it's very important at access review time, even though you pointed out some difficulties with that, David, that's still the predominant way that access review and certification takes place in most organizations. Now at runtime, which we'll be focusing more on here momentarily, RBAC has a role, but it's somewhat limited. It's quite good for very basic use cases. If I just have basic requirements to know, I need to know that someone is a manager, or they're a doctor, or some other macro business function. Great, roles are terrific for that. But in more complex scenarios, what we see happening in most legacy systems is that the application recognizes the role of the user, but then has to do the rest of the heavy lifting on its own to figure out the logic of who should access what. So in the next slide here, this is where we lead to this infamous hard-coded access logic, right? That you have hundreds or typically even thousands of these kind of if-then-else clauses scattered in your application code, and that also causes difficulty in getting the transparency right, David, or the visibility into what's happening within the applications from a security perspective.
I mean, there's a couple of points here. It makes it more expensive to develop the application, of course, because now the developer has to write the security code too. So they're spending time on the business logic, but they're also spending time on the security side of the application. The other aspect, of course, is that developers might be great at developing apps, but they're typically not great at developing security. These are two very different jobs in a way. So when you let security being handled in code, not only is it hard to audit, like you said, Jerry, but also the quality of that code might not be very good.
Right. So you can save some money and resource up front if the developer doesn't have to focus on this and spend time on this here. But it also is critical for ongoing maintenance, because if your access rules do change in the future, and typically they do, well, then you have to take the developer time again to maintain that. And we've seen that that's a cost that sometimes is overlooked. It's not just the upfront expense of the developer just writing their own routines, but then what to do down the road when you ultimately need to change those rules, which means you need to change that source code.
Right, and we do see larger companies, Fortune 500 companies, coming to us, to Axiomatics, and asking us for our solutions for the sake of consolidation, so the ability to extract the authorization logic from the different applications and centralize it into a central point. Their main driver there is not so much the fine-grained access control. It is a driver, but first and foremost, the main driver is consolidation and centralization.
Yeah, that's a good point. But another issue, David, that you often talk about is relationships. And this is definitely a shortcoming of the role-based model.
Yes, indeed. So the key limitation in RBAC, in role-based access control, is the fact that RBAC cannot express relationships. And when I first talk to people about attribute-based access control and I want them to understand the key benefits, that's the one I bring up. In RBAC, you don't have relationships. In ABAC, you do. Doesn't that sound so much nicer? So what do I mean? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. First, let's start with nurses can view medical records in their unit. How would you implement that in RBAC? Nurse is the role. Fine. View is an action or a permission, or it could even be view medical record as a whole is the permission. But what about their unit, Jerry? What is that? You know, how do you want to implement this? That's typically.
Well, that sounds like something that the application would have to handle on its own.
Correct. Exactly. You would be forced to write an if statement in your code and say, oh, get me the role of my user. Okay. If my user is a nurse, then if their unit is equal to the unit of the department of the medical record, then permit. So what you're doing now is hard coding some of the logic inside your app, and that's the danger. That's what we want to move away from. Again, if you hard code, you lose visibility, you lose auditability, and you lose maintenance. So that's what RBAC can't do. Another example, and by the way, the first example is what I would call an indirect relationship. You have the nurse is assigned to a unit, oncology as an example, and you have a medical record, and that medical record is assigned to a unit as well. And through the unit assignment, nurses get access to the medical record. This is an indirect relationship. The second example we have here is a direct relationship. How would you implement in RBAC? Doctors can edit medical records they're assigned to. Would you actually create a role? Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, again, David, there's just no way to do that, right, without the custom code in your application.
Right. So there are workarounds. You could actually create a role per unit. So you could have nurse oncology, nurse cardiology, so on and so forth. And that is what leads to your role explosion. It's bad enough when you deal with attributes like unit because you might have 10, 20, 100 units, but it gets much, much worse when you deal with user identities because then would you have a primary physician role or would you have a doctor underscore patient 1, doctor underscore patient 2? And you see, Jerry, how that doesn't scale because either you only have one patient and you're out of business or you have many patients and you just can't manage your IT. And that's not just it. It's not just about relationships. Relationships is really the first benefit you're going to get with ABAC and the first and biggest limitation of RBAC. But there's also cases or advanced scenarios like delegations that you cannot really express in role-based access control. The example I have here on the slide at the bottom is what I call the vacation policy. What if your primary physician is away on vacation or away in a different hospital for a while? You, the patient, you still want to get treatment. So how would you be able in RBAC to implement a delegation policy whereby your primary physician will grant access to another physician so that they can handle your medical record? You can't do that in RBAC. So that brings us to how attribute-based access control rekindled our passion for role-based access control. ABAC is here to help role-based access control and extend its capabilities into the 21st century, into this new world of IT where you have many more users, a lot more data, more complex data, by the way, and a lot more applications and processes. So ABAC stands for Attribute-Based Access Control. I think I might have mentioned it before in this webinar. And the idea of ABAC is that you're still going to use roles. Roles are a fundamental part of ABAC. But in addition to that, in addition to the roles, you're going to extend to other attributes. And the roles and the attributes are all going to be a part of the access decision process. And those attributes you're going to be using, they're not just going to be about who you are. Remember, Jerry, you said that RBAC was very ego-centric. You know, let's stop talking about me. I want to talk about myself instead. Well, in ABAC, you broaden your horizon and you look around and you realize that you're not alone on this planet. So with ABAC, it's not just about who you are, but it's also what it is you want to do, where you want to do it, when you want to do it, how you want to do it, and why, what the purpose of use is. And I usually call that the 5 W's and the H. And those are the questions you want to ask yourselves when you're defining your authorization requirements. Who is the user? What are they trying to get access to? Where are they trying to get access from? How they're doing it, and why, what the purpose of use is. Now that we have attributes, and many different types of attributes, describing different dimensions of your authorization equation, you can actually bring those attributes together in policies. And we'll talk a bit more about that on the following slide. But we often say that ABAC enables policy-based access control, or PBAC. And the policy really will be the secret ingredient to the success of ABAC. Another aspect to ABAC, go ahead, Jerry.
I was going to say that attributes get all the attention here because that's the first A in the acronym. But of course, the policy is the secret sauce, as you said. We'll talk more about that momentarily.
Right. The other angle or dimension to ABAC is that it enables externalized and centralized authorization. Now, the idea of externalizing authorization is not new. You have authorization frameworks that do that, like Spring Security. But the idea that you can externalize it and centralize it, standardize it, and use policies, that's really a benefit of ABAC. And one of the key benefits of centralizing authorization is that your auditing is going to be easier. You're going to be saving time when you develop new applications. It's very much about helping achieve the consolidation that so many businesses are looking for. So instead of rewriting the same authorization logic 10 times or 20 times across a wide range of different applications, you can write it once and then enforce it multiple times. Now, if you want to read up some more on ABAC, there's a lot of great literature out there. NIST wrote a great report a couple of years back called NIST SP. I think it's Special Publication it stands for.
Yes, that's right.
800-162, and there's lots of great videos on YouTube as well that we recommend that you watch. And to wrap up on this slide, Jerry, I'd like to finish this with this interesting quote from Gartner, who said a year or so ago that between now and 2020, the 70% of enterprises will be using ABAC as the main mechanism to protect their critical assets. And that shows two things. Number one, that ABAC is growing very quickly. It's growing very quickly because there's a critical need for it. That's the first part to the quote. The second part is that it will be focused on critical assets. So only on those assets that really deserve that level of protection. You know the principle in security is that if your item is worth $10, then you shouldn't spend $100 worth of security on that item. It's not worth it. Well, it's the same here. You're going to want to use ABAC for those critical assets, and those could be medical records, those could be PII, those could be banking information, so on and so forth.
That's right, David. Yeah, at Gartner they've recognized this trend for a few years now, and they also have quite a lot of good research on the topic. So in addition to NIST, they're a good research source if you're a subscriber to that.
Right. And as we said on the previous slide, Jerry, the secret sauce or the secret ingredient really in ABAC is the policy language. It's the ability to bind all the attributes into a grammar, into a policy. And what's really nice about the policy language is that it bridges the gap between the original business requirement, authorization requirement, and the actual technical implementations. One of the key drawbacks, I think, to RBAC is that so many backs in this sentence is that you end up creating artificial roles. You end up creating roles where you do not understand the semantics of those roles anymore in order to achieve the right level of access control. And in doing so, you broaden the gap, you widen the gap between the original requirement and the actual implementation, which means that in RBAC it's really difficult to reconcile the requirements with the implementation. In ABAC, however, because the policies are pretty much plain old English, and because they build on natural attributes like department, citizenship, role, date of birth, classification, clearance, the policy you write with those natural attributes will be a natural policy, and it will be a great reflection of the original requirement. So it closes the gap, it bridges the gap between the original authorization requirement and the actual technical implementation. So here are a couple examples on the slide here. Doctors can view medical records of any patient in their department. We all understand what that means. There's no ambiguity. We know what it is. We know what a doctor is. We know what a medical record is, and we know what the department is. We can all understand that. We can review that. We can certify that policy. It's very simple. Another example here is sales managers in the West region can view previous quarter results of products in the SaaS category once the results have been approved by accounting. Again, it's a very simple requirement, and the implementation is a direct reflection of that requirement.
And then, David, another thing I've heard you describe, or a way to describe what's happening here, is you're actually removing this logic from the application and instantiating it in the authorization service, that centralized service you mentioned. So the logic is being removed from the application, but you retain the logic of the access rule in this policy language, and that also allows you to implement it and enforce it consistently across applications, but to give you a clearer access review and certification perspective on what's happening in those applications.
That's a very good point. So not only does it make application development easier, but on top of that, it makes the enforcement and the decision-making of the authorization consistent and coherent throughout your stack. So if you have an N-tier application and you're applying authorization in the presentation tier, in your API tier, in your business tier, and then finally all the way down to your data tier, if you've managed to externalize the authorization, express it as policies inside your central authorization service, then you will be able to consistently, coherently apply the same authorization checks across your different tiers. So let's go back to the healthcare example we had a couple slides ago. Nurses can view medical records in their units. And then the other example, the direct relationship, doctors can edit medical records of patients they are assigned to. The first thing you want to do is get rid of those artificial overloaded roles. If you have a long list of roles that mention nurse underscore oncology, nurse underscore pediatrics, nurse underscore hospital 123, get rid of those. Those are artificial roles that you had to create and manage and maintain because you didn't have any other way of doing it. You want to get rid of them, keep the one business role that matters, nurse, and then you want to create another attribute called department. And by the way, very often that attribute already exists within your environment, so it's just a matter of using it. You don't have to create it, it's already there. And if you want to use additional attributes, contextual information like time of the day or location of the user, or perhaps sensitivity of the patient you're dealing with, if we're talking about a VIP or a patient with a particular disease, these are all attributes we can use. So you can see here in the picture, in the diagram at the bottom, that on the left we have the user and the user's attributes. On the right we have the resource, the medical record, and that record's attributes. And then in the middle, binding everything together, we have the ABAC policy. That policy will use attributes of the user, attributes of the resource, attributes of the action, and the context to determine what is allowed and what is not allowed. Another aspect to keep in mind, we had a question a while back on role explosion and policy explosion. So in RBAC, role explosion is a key problem, and we saw that earlier. In ABAC, you don't have that issue because you can use any number of values it doesn't matter. You have a single policy, and whether you have 5 departments, 10 departments, or 100 departments, it's still the one policy. In ABAC, you make your attributes evolve. You assign different attribute values to different users and different resources, but the policy itself doesn't change. So here on this slide, I have 3 different users, 3 different departments, and 4 different resources with 4 different departments as well, and the policy hasn't changed. And note how the last resource in the bottom right corner is, quote, a new department. The fact that we bring in a new department will not make us rewrite the policy because the policy is already designed to cater to new scenarios, new values.
Right, David, and that design is really the variables in the policy, right? And you just compare one variable to another here.
Yes. So the piece of code that you would have written within your application stating if user department is equal to record department, that's the piece that is going to move away from the application and into the policy. And that gives it visibility and maintainability, of course. So ABAC enables new scenarios. So the combination of role-based access control and attribute-based access control will let us do new things that were not possible before. And all the better because the environments we're in today, the new regulations, the new compliance rules, the new business requirements need those scenarios. So a great example is what I called the vacation policy earlier, and it's essentially delegation. And the idea is that I, Dr. Bob, want to give Dr. Carol access to my patients when I'm away, so that patients get continuous treatment whether I'm away or not away. They will be cared for by other doctors. And that is a scoped access in the sense that it's only allowed when I, the doctor, am away. If I'm not away, then Carol loses access to my patient's records. Another example, Jerry, that I hear a lot of is the ability to manage records for other people in the care relationship. For instance, I, Alice, want to access my children's medical records for as long as they're under 18 years of age. And conversely, you might want to care for those people in your family or people you care for that are not capable of handling their own medical records. For instance, elderly parents or sick members of family.
Yeah, and David, this, I mean, you're using a medical example here, but this applies even in a banking scenario, that your children might have bank accounts that you also want to monitor. So you're using a medical record example, but we see these similar scenarios applicable across a number of industries.
Yes, indeed, and I would say that we see it mainly in consumer-facing industries, so health insurance, healthcare, private or retail banking, these types of industries, but not only. The second interesting scenario is the ability to use context in your authorization policies. Context awareness. So here's an example. I, Dr. Bob, only get access to medical records within a medical context, meaning at the hospital, during office hours, from a corporate device. So here we're using location information. Is the user connected from the hospital network? We're using the hours the doctor is supposed to be working. And we're also using device information. Is the device a managed device or is it a personal device? That can help us determine how much information we're willing to return to the doctor. If they were using a personal information, perhaps they would only get access to the patient's name and description. If we're dealing with a corporate device, they might get all the detailed medical data relating to that customer or patient. However, we can also build backdoors or emergency scenarios, contextual emergency scenarios. For instance, here, the break the glass type of policy where I, Dr. Bob, can get access to a patient's record if this is an emergency. So here the contextual attribute is the fact that the doctor will wave the emergency flag, will break the glass and say, okay, I know I'm not supposed to get access to this patient's record, but they're about to die, so either I don't get access or I save their lives. The equation is pretty simple. Another scenario is collaboration, and that's quite interesting because the more data we collect in today's world, the better we can actually use that data, analyze that data for other purposes. It could be for medical research. It could be for optimizing prices for an insurance company, for instance. Now that everything is digital, we can gather and analyze that data. However, in doing so, we want to make sure that we don't breach any laws or any privacy. And this is where ABAC is going to fit in really nicely. First example, I, the lab researcher, want to gather as much medical data I can without breaching patient privacy. So you could imagine now that hospitals might expose an API where researchers can connect to and grab medical records, but in doing so, you would want to remove any PII or PHI that could be used to identify to whom the record belongs. Similarly, I, the insurance company, want to analyze treatment trends for a particular medical condition, again, without breaching patient privacy. And then the final scenario I want to bring up, Jerry, is what I call end-to-end user experience. Now that everything is digitized, when we go, and again, this is a healthcare example, but as you mentioned, it could be applied to other scenarios. But when I go to my GP and I get a prescription and I get a diagnosis for whatever I have, and I'm referred to a hospital for a treatment and perhaps even a specialist care provider, and then of course I want to get refunds for the treatment I received, then I would really like it if everything was automated and if the data flowed through that chain of different actors. At the same time, I want to make sure that only the relevant information is shared with the relevant individuals, again, for privacy purposes. And this is what ABAC can deliver by applying the right policies in the right locations to make sure that, yes, we can share more data, but only safely and only while respecting the privacy of that data and the privacy of the patient.
Yeah, it sounds like a bit of a nirvana, David, but certainly that's the objective in making the the healthcare industry more digital, so that we can remove some of the friction and cost out of the equation. But if what you're describing here is how our security software can help get us closer to that end state goal.
You'll have to excuse the lousy joke, Jerry, but I can't resist it. Was Nirvana a band when RBAC was formalized? That was before my time, so I'm not too sure.
No comment, thank you.
Sorry about that. All right, so here's an example of what ABAC looks like in reality. This is a screenshot of the policy editor that comes with the Axiomatics policy server. And here you can see how we've implemented a simple example. Doctors can view medical records of patients they are assigned it to. That's the normal general permit case. And then we restrict the access to corporate devices and to times when the doctor is on duty. We also have an emergency policy that will grant access to the medical information regardless of the device and regardless of whether the doctor is on duty and regardless of the assignment of the doctor to the medical record if it is an emergency. And the way we've implemented this is we created a nice structure here where the parent policy focuses on medical records, and then inside we have 4 different policies. The first 2 policies are positive policies. They grant access to the information. The last 2 policies are negative policies. They deny access. So the corporate device check, I've converted that into a negative check. In other words, I want to deny access if the device is not managed. Similarly, the check about the doctor being on duty, I flipped that around and made that a negative check. I want to deny access if the doctor is not on duty. And then, of course, I can choose the order in which the policies are evaluated. So the emergency bypass is considered first because I want to make sure that access will be granted if it is an emergency. And before I hand it over to you, sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
No, not at all.
Okay. So before I hand it back to you, Jerry, for our conclusion, all I want to say is that we have a simple starter package called the Express Edition that you can download from our support web after registration. And the Express Edition comes pre-bundled with everything you need to get started, including a simple tutorial for you to understand the basics of ABAC. So we really recommend that you give it a go. It's pretty much unzip, run the wizard, and you're good to go in 5 minutes. On that note, Jerry, over to you.
Yeah, And in 10 minutes, if you read all the instructions, it's really fast. And by the way, in the age of Google and the internet, you can answer almost any meaningless trivia question quickly. Nirvana was founded in 1987, so a few years before the RBAC standard. All right. All right, back to the serious stuff. So a few concluding remarks here, and then we'll wrap up with some Q&A from the attendees. And if you do have some questions, please do put them in the GoToWebinar question box. But so we're, obviously RBAC's been the dominant model and approach for administrative time access control for many, many years. But as we tried to point out today, we have a lot of business scenarios today that are really stretching its limitations and its capabilities, and that's where they can be extended by using these other attributes and the policies to make things much more dynamic and flexible. So we want to ensure that you are getting the message that we are not replacing RBAC, we are only enhancing it and extending your existing investment by supplementing it with an attribute and policy-based approach. And David, we're ready for some questions from the audience.
Okay, bring them on.
All right. Well, you briefly touched on this earlier, but I think we should talk a little bit more about the potential for policy explosion. This is a question that comes up from time to time. Can you talk about how we don't see that as much of an issue in our experience?
Well, it's really a combination of two different things. The first aspect is what we mentioned during the webinar. It's the fact that policies scale well because you write one policy that caters to many different values. So for instance, if you have a policy that says nurses can view medical records in their own department, it doesn't matter how many departments you have, how many nurses you have, how many hospitals you have. The policy is generic enough that it can cater to as many values as you like. And that's because in the policy we don't refer to the value itself, but rather we have the condition that compares the attribute of the user to the attribute of the medical record. Now, the other aspect to policy explosion, of course, could be that you want to have multiple applications, maybe 100 applications or more, protected by the same authorization service. In that case, you need a policy or a set of policies capable of serving those 100-plus applications, some of which might be radically different. Well, the way to solve that is through policy collaboration. So you want each application owner to write their own policy, save them, commit them to a version control mechanism, and then you'll have a policy packager, another role within your administration, and that policy packager will be responsible for assembling or packaging all the policies together from the different application owners, potentially apply global policy checks like enterprise security checks that you want to apply, and deploy the resulting package to your authorization service.
Yeah, that sounds fair enough. We also see this come up sometimes in SaaS models or multi-tenant models where the enterprise thinks they would have to create policies for each tenant, which of course can quickly become difficult to manage. And the same approach comes into play there, right? You use these variables so you can use fewer policies across a broader audience. And it reminds me too, David, of an example a few years ago where a customer wanted us to do some benchmarking of the system with 10 or 15,000 policies because they thought they would end up with that many. Ultimately, I think they only ended up with a few hundred in the actual production deployment. So it was another example of where they thought they were going to end up with a lot more policies to manage than what they did.
Correct. That was, for them, it was a really nice surprise. They were used to the RBAC model where things would explode, and when they realized that with ABAC it's feeling much better, that was a really nice welcome surprise.
Right, right. Okay, next up we've got a really good question here, and that is what tools are available to report on the resultant authorization for a user or a group of users? And David, I think this is what's applicable here is a new product we're working on to actually be able to review the policies to answer these kind of questions. Do you want to talk about it a little bit?
Sure. So it's first of all, it's a question that we get a lot from customers. So it's not a new requirement. We've heard that question time and time again. And what we've been working on for the past few months is a new product called the Review Manager, capable of analyzing the policy and creating access review reports that focus on a set of users or focus on a single user, or could even focus on a specific item. So with the Review Manager, you're capable of answering questions of the form, what can Alice do, or what can managers do, or who can view medical record 1, 2, 3. So with the Review Manager, you can get a pretty good overview of your authorizations that are possible through the policies.
Right. Another example that people, of a question that people want to answer is, if it's a banking environment, who can view the records of a VIP client, or in a hospital system, we've seen cases where staff can view, a celebrity client's records. So you might want to test your policies and report on, who can see the admission record of a celebrity client, for example. So yeah, the Review Manager tool will be able to create those kind of reports and help with those kind of questions. All right, another one here is about your emergency break the glass example, David. Can you describe how you would trigger that emergency condition to override the other policies?
Sure. So the application the end user is using would have to have a button or some kind of interface widget that the user can use to click on that button essentially and declare that yes, this is an emergency. And what it means is that in your policies you would have two branches to your policy. One would be the regular branch. You can view the records that are assigned to you. The other would have a scope in the policy that would have an attribute called is emergency. And if this emergency is true, then go down that path and grant access to the doctor. Note that in addition to giving access, we can also trigger alerts in the system so that we could log the fact that the doctor said it was an emergency situation. That's actually important from an accountability perspective because you want to make sure that people don't break the glass on purpose to gain access to information they're not supposed to see. You want to hold them accountable. It kind of reminds me of, and I don't know if this is an urban myth, but when I was a kid, they always told us that if we pulled the fire alarm in the school, there would be some kind of ink that would come out of the fire alarm handle that would stain our hands. I don't know if that's true. I never tried. So that's kind of a way of holding accountable.
But apparently you believe that, though. Okay, that's good.
Yeah,
it worked.
I'm very naive, you know.
All right, a couple more questions here. One is, can we review failed attempts? Absolutely. That's just part of the audit log. So any attempted access that fails just writes a record to the logs. That's pretty simple.
And you know what, Jerry?
Yep.
Before we move on to the next question, that's another huge benefit of centralizing authorization. Because in a traditional RBAC model, since it's down to the application to do whatever they want to do with the role and have this additional logic, we don't know what they're doing, we don't know what they're enforcing, and we don't know how and when they've enforced it. In the central model, we end up having central decision-making, which means that we end up having central logs. So if you want to know who got access to what, we have that information centrally. It's much easier to generate reports, but also to act on those reports. So you could imagine that if a user tries access 5 times in a row and gets denied 5 times in a row, you can start thinking that there's something fishy going on, and you can actually act on that to move from a reactive security model to a more proactive security model.
Right. That's a good point. Maybe we'll make this the last question. We talked about roles being used mostly at administrative time and ABAC more suited to runtime authorization. But actually there's been cases where you can use ABAC to drive the role assignment and provisioning process, which is another example of how the two technologies can work together. Do you want to add any additional comment to that?
I didn't catch that. Sorry, Jerry. Can you repeat it?
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's where sometimes we often talk about roles being used primarily at administrative time,
Right.
and ABAC is better suited for runtime access control. But in fact, they can be used together to drive the user provisioning process.
Yes, indeed, absolutely, and we do see some customers at Axiomatics using ABAC to drive the authorization provisioning. The rationale is that sometimes you can't retrofit your applications to fully utilize ABAC. So what you want to do instead is you want to drive the automated assignment of roles and permissions to users through ABAC policies. So your policies, instead of being about direct access control, for instance, nurse view medical record, they become policies about which role and which permission a user can have. So for instance, a user can have the role nurse if they do not have the role doctor, for instance. You can't be a nurse and a doctor at the same time. So this is what you could use ABAC for.
All right, very good. Well, David, I think we'll wrap up this session right there. Thank you for joining me for this webinar, and thank our audience for attending. And please be on the lookout for future webinar schedule. We'll have a couple more up on the website soon. And of course, we're entering into conference season, so we'll look forward to seeing some of you at those industry events in the near future. All right, thanks again, everyone, for attending, and we'll see you all soon.